Now this tank is known as the Conqueror. It's FV214. It was actually designed as a heavy tank, but it has quite a long story which I'll try and encompass in this chat if I can.
Please remember to like, subscribe or click the little notification bell if you don't want to miss out on these videos. And I'd just like to say thank you to all our patrons for making this possible. Please join them if you can.
We'll start at the bottom. I think it makes sense, and gradually work our way up. The first thing to look at is the suspension. It's mostly hidden by the boxed-in skirting you can see, but it's really like, in a sense, like the Centurion suspension, only smaller, more little rollers and smaller springs. But it works on the same principle. The only difference is that the rollers in this case have the rubber between the rim and the hub of the wheel. So in other words, you've got, as far as the rollers are concerned, you've got steel on the tracks and only the rubber inside. Now that's very much like some of the later German tanks in the Second World War, probably where they got the idea from. It is resilient and it does save the rubber, but it makes a heck of a noise, metal on metal, coupled with the noise of the engine from this thing, made it one of the noisiest tanks that was ever loosed on the public. But quite interesting for all that. It's got 4 bogies aside, typical rear drive sprocket and front track adjusting sprocket, exactly the same as any other tank, only it's a lot bigger. Now the hull, which is all of welded construction, it's mainly armoured to about 6 inches, 7 inches at the front. So it's quite well armoured for its day. And actually at the time, when it was in service, between 1955 and 1966, it was the heaviest tank in service anywhere in the world, 65 tons. So it was quite a monster. It was powered by the Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, not because it was the best engine in the world, but because it was all that was available at the time. It was actually a fuel-injected version of the Meteor, which delivered about 800 horsepower, a little bit better than the horsepower rating of an ordinary Meteor, which is about 600 horsepower. So it gave 800 horsepower through a Merritt-Brown transmission, just the same as any other tank. It meant that off the main roads, it was probably almost as fast as an ordinary tank, as say a Centurion. And it worked quite well, but it was really a heavy tank, and it was meant to be, of course. So that's really the basic structure. Now that part of the tank, that is the hull, the engine, all that transmission and so on, is all the same as what was originally designated as A45 or FV201, the original universal tank. Now this whole concept of a universal tank was actually coined by, what's his name, Field Marshal Montgomery. At the end of the war, he couldn't understand the difference between an infantry tank and a cruiser tank. He wanted something that brought both together. So he coined this term universal tank, and it was applied to FV201. The trouble was that having built FV201, it only had a Centurion turret with a 20-pounder gun, and 2 versions of it, at least 3 versions of it really. The DD, the amphibious version, and the bridge layer were both too big to fit on an existing land craft, so they wouldn't work. And the other one they wanted to build, the minesweeping flail, was too long. It had an extra gearbox at the back, which made it longer than the hull that was readily available. So they decided to do away with FV201 completely. So the whole thing, the whole concept of this universal tank vanished. It wasn't that good anyway. For a start, it had the same gun as the Centurion. So the 20-pounder, the 83mm gun. And that was deemed to be useless against the heavy Russian stuff, which is what they were beginning to think of after the war as the next sort of potential enemy. So they did away with FV201 completely, with the exception of the heavy gun version, FV214, which is this thing. And this, it took a while to come out because it took them quite a long time to design the turret. But it is much bigger than any of the tanks you'll find around at the same time. Just for a while anyway, bigger even than the Russian tanks it was meant to obliterate. The next part of the tank is the turret, and that's the most important part. It did take a while to make because it's a large casting, one of the biggest they'd ever tried. And the gun itself was quite unusual. It's American 120mm, but we'll come to that in a minute. So that's the next feature. It's a powered turret. It traverses under power, but it will only traverse to a limited speed, obviously. Now the gun it was built by the Royal Ordnance Factory, but it's a version of what started out as an anti-aircraft gun in American service and was later adopted for use on one of their tanks, the M103. We've got one of those here somewhere, and it's worth doing a comparison sometime between M103 and the British Conqueror, which were more or less contemporary. The only difference is M103 lasted a good deal longer. But otherwise, they're more or less had the same gun in them. That's the gun. It's 120mm, as I say. It only fired 2 rounds, at least the 2 types of rounds. They supplied APDS, which is armor-piercing, discarding sabot, and HESH, which is high-explosive squash head. So it fired armor-piercing, it fired a form of high explosive, but literally only those 2. There were no other rounds made available for that gun at all. You had to use one or the other of those. They were stowed inside, a few in the turret in a ready use, or near the turret in a ready use position, the rest near the driver, who could pass them back if need be, if he hadn't got anything else to do. He was only driving the tank after all. This, as I said before, is a Mark I. They only built about 20 of these. The rest, and I think they built about 158 in the end, the rest were Mark IIs. You can always tell by the periscopes around the driver's position. If there's 3, it's a Mark I. If there's 1 periscope, for all the views that you get in there, it's a Mark II, and that's one of the ways of telling the 2 tanks apart, but there's not many. They're almost identical in every other respect. It's got a 4-man crew, that is 3 men in the turret, and the driver who sits down here at the front. Now the driver, as I say, sits in here. He's got the normal controls, but they actually instructed young drivers who were learning to double declutch both up the box and down, which meant quite a struggle for a driver. But later on, drivers with some experience came to find that you could change upwards more quickly if you first of all got hold of one of the levers, there were 2, which took care of steering, and you used one of those just to brake the engine speed a bit. You slowed the engine down, therefore you could change up quickly through one gear or the other, and you needed to do it very quickly, because if the tank was left to its own devices for a moment, it would roll to a halt, and you'd have to go back to first and start again. So an experienced driver was worth having in one of these, but there weren't that many of them anyway, because, well, there weren't that many tanks anyway, and that's probably why. Now, as I say, the turret mounts a 120mm gun and a coaxial Browning alongside, which is actually almost lost in this mess up here. Huge mantlet, or about 10 inches thick in armour protection. It was one of the best armoured parts of the tank, actually. But the turret itself was about 9 inches thick in most places, which meant it was a fairly tough proposition for anyone to crack. That's why these tanks have lasted as hard targets for years and years, and still, you can still recognise what they are when they've been shot to pieces, because they resist most of the incoming rounds quite effectively. Now, the other thing they had, which affects the gun, is that the gun was on a stabiliser. Now normally a stabiliser is used to hold a gun steady no matter what the tank's doing. So the idea was that you could bounce over rough ground and the gun would remain on target. With the Conqueror it was different. The stabiliser was put in to keep the gun from wrecking the mounting it was on. It meant that when this tank was doing any speed over 1.5 miles per hour, the stabiliser came into action. And the first view anyone had of a Conqueror coming towards them was normally the gun peering over the crest of the hill as it approached, up and down all the time. Nobody could do anything about it, it just kept doing that. You couldn't load it from inside because the breech was moving all the time. You couldn't stop it from outside or you'd wreck the entire gun mounting. The only time when it wasn't like that was when the turret was reversed, which it was for normal driving, and then the gun was lowered and mounted all in a clamp at the back, so it was held by the clamp and didn't waddle about. Otherwise it was all over the place. But anyway, that was part of the nuisance of having such a big gun in such a big tank. The turret itself is interesting. It features 3 men, the loader, the gunner, and then the tank commander at the back. Now the loader and the gunner, for all the size of this turret, and it is quite enormous compared with any other, both of their positions were fairly cramped. They more or less had to stay where they were put. And really that was it. But the commander was in a different thing altogether. For a start, he had a totally rotating command post at the top of the tank. You can see it quite well when you get up a bit higher and look down on the tank. It meant that the whole section he was in rotated under power independently of the rest of the turret. So what would happen was this. The commander would select a target, and we'll assume for the moment he's selected a heavy Russian tank. He'll select that target, and then using his telescope, he would put down what was needed for the velocity of the round that went into it, and also the range. For the range, he actually had his own range finder built into the turret. It was a coincidental range finder, worked on like a tube with a mirror at each end. It was the only British tank to have a rangefinder built into it, actually. So it meant that the commander could find the target, could latch onto it, and send a message to the gunner, which came up on the screen of his own sights, which gave the range and everything else needed to hit that tank. So all the gunner had to do was turn the turret round to face the enemy tank and fire the gun to the figures he got on his own sight. That's all he had to worry about. Now, while he was doing that, the commander was free to select the next target. So what it meant was that the tank was in effect what we would now call a hunter-killer tank. It actually went out looking for fights and looking for vehicles to destroy, and that's what it was, a pure hunter-killer tank. But it also came up with a system which was faster than any other tank in existence. It could look at a target, and while the gunner's firing at one, it could be selecting the next one, and so on. And that really was remarkable for a tank like this. It meant it could take out one tank after another. In fact, these tanks were never, ever used in action. They were issued to each regiment in small numbers, some of whom used them collectively as part of a squadron. Others just issued them to each squadron, and they came together at the end to fire above and over the heads of the existing tanks, which were normally Centurions. The job of the Conqueror was to take out the Russian heavy tanks, which were at the back of their attack, and they'd take them out before they got anywhere near the Centurions, which they could seriously damage. And that's what the purpose of the Conqueror was. But the Conqueror never saw any action at all. It was in service in what was then known as West Germany for years. But from about 1966 onwards, it had vanished completely. This and the Centurion were taken over by Chieftain, which is the next in line here. And with that, the Conqueror disappears. The only thing was there were 2 armoured recovery vehicle versions of Conqueror, one of which, the ARV Mark II, is regarded as one of the best ARVs, or recovery vehicles, the British Army's ever had. And that was one of the few variations of this thing. They did talk about a version with a rear-mounted turret mounting a 183mm gun or 180mm gun, which was meant because the gun on this thing, although it's big and quite powerful, still couldn't take out the Russian tanks it was meant to take out. They stood a better chance of taking out it, which wasn't really the idea, but that's why they went for this 180mm gun. But as far as we know, it never got beyond the mock-up stage and was only as an idea, really. Not a real tank, but quite interesting all the same. So here we have it. This is the Conqueror. In its day, one of the biggest, heaviest tanks in the world.